I would like to describe a field in which little has been done, but in which an enormous amount can be done. This field is not quite the same as the others in that it will tell us little of fundamental physics, but it will tell us much about the strange phenomena that occur just below our perception. In contrast to the natural philosophers of the past, the scientists of this field delve into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. Their quest is to understand and create the imperceptible. After all, there is plenty of room at the bottom.
All right, hello and welcome to the Materialism podcast, an exploration of the past, present, and future of material science. I am your host, Taylor Sparks, and I am not joined by Andrew Falkowski. He's off on Christmas vacation, so we're recording this over the break. But I am joined by a mentor of mine who I met, at the very beginning of my academic career, Chuck Ward. Chuck is the editor-in-chief at IMMI. He's going to tell us what that journal is, what it stands for. Chuck, you want to do an introduction?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Taylor, and thanks for having me on. Really excited about the opportunity to tell everyone a little bit about IMMI. So I guess I'll just start by saying that I spent 36 years with the Air Force in a variety of roles, mostly R&D, starting out actually as active duty officer and then switching over to a civilian career. So retired 2.5 years from that job. So I had really broad exposure to a lot of different perspectives on R&D, all the way from very basic research through applied, through strategic level planning, if you will, Pentagon and all. So kind of a broad career. So when this opportunity came along to participate in IMMI, I really was excited about it. Prior to that, I had been working on really, well, let me start by saying, National Academies published this report in 2008 called Integrated Computational Materials Engineering, and it really caught on within the community, really starting with the metals community, but I think broadened out from there. And so it's this whole idea of, can we do R&D a lot more efficiently and quicker, arrive at solutions at much more efficient timescales. And so that was kind of an impetus. And there had been a lot of work before that. So I'm not discounting that, but that was kind of one of the linchpin things that got things moving along. And I got very interested in that and started working on that in the laboratory. Yeah, everything kind of bloomed from there.
Cool. I didn't realize you were active duty in the Air Force. So was that going down the science track, or was that simultaneously? Like, was that GI Bill? What was that?
No, actually, well, I started out as ROTC and then got my bachelor's degree and master's degree in material science and joined
Oh,
the Air
good
Force.
man.
The first assignment was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate. So out of my 36 years, I did something like 32 in the laboratory in a variety of spots, whether in Dayton or Washington or London or Germany, back to Dayton. Was all R&D focused.
Okay, very cool. And materials then, since that was your background, fascinating. Is Air Force traditionally been very interested in new materials?
Yes, yeah, yeah. The It's a long history. It's I think one of the oldest laboratories within the Air Force structure is in materials. So all the way back to the Wright brothers and all, how do you get better rubber for tires, better aluminum for engines, and then the whole
Yeah,
moving
that makes
on
sense.
to metallic structure for aircraft and all. Yeah, so the Air Force history in materials is well over 100 years old, and the original laboratory was here in Dayton, Ohio.
No way. Well, that's
Yeah.
awesome. So 2008, people start saying, hey, there's something about computational approaches that is going to improve the way that we find, develop, whatever new materials. You start getting interested. Fast forward to today, you've been the editor-in-chief at IMMI, which stands for Integrating Materials and Manufacturing Innovation, which is a journal. Connect the dots for me. How did you go from, hey, computational tools are cool, to let's have a journal associated with integrating materials and manufacturing innovation?
Yeah. So with that National Academies report on ICME for short in 2008, the Air Force lab got very interested in really taking it on as a strategic initiative to try to promulgate that philosophy and discipline across a number of materials classes, if you will. And so I was heavily engaged in that. At the time, I was a division chief leading a materials research division. And so I was really piloting it within the division. And then we did metals, ceramics, ceramic matrix composites, and non-destructive evaluation. So how do you, and at that time, it's that confluence of computation and experiment and bringing that together, right, to accelerate things and deploy materials much more quickly. Fast forward just another year or two, and then the White House started getting very interested in what they could do in science policy. And I won't go through all the boring details, but probably in about 2010 or so, they really honed in on, hey, can we do something in materials as an initiative? And there was an interagency group formed. I was on it, and I know Jim Warren was there at the very beginning, so I got to develop a relationship with Jim, and then Julie Christodoulou got involved. So a lot of names very familiar within the materials community, and we started fleshing out what would such an initiative look like. And it is, again, we arrived at this bringing together computation and experiment with the currency between the two being data and models,
Mm-hmm.
of bringing it together. And so that ended up being launched by the White House in 2011 as the Materials Genome Initiative. And so when that was launched, much fanfare and all, and a lot of excitement, although many of us were very excited about the name at the time, to be honest with you. But that wasn't our decision.
Materials don't have genes, but it's okay.
Exactly.
we deal with
Exactly.
it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, some argue, well, thermodynamics is the gene of materials. So let's start there. So from there, immediately after the launch, TMS, or the Minerals, Metals, and Materials Society, said, "Hey, what could we do in this area is strategically to help support the Materials Genome Initiative? We're one of the leading materials societies, professional societies globally. So what can we do to support that?" They formed an ad hoc committee to start looking at options on what could be done. Where were there gaps where they could perhaps play a leadership role? So I was asked to be on that ad hoc committee. Liz Holm led the committee. And again, I think we stood up in something like July. It was right after the MGI was announced. And by the fall, we had arrived at one of the opportunities was to start a new journal that would directly support some of the concepts of MGI that the committee, the ad hoc committee, felt were not currently addressed in the community.
Yeah.
And
So I'm kind of curious about that. Were there not
yeah,
journals that would have published this sort of thing? So MGI, it's got its 4 pillars, right? It's like we should do fewer straight up experiments. We should pair it with computation. We should develop a savvy workforce that can work in this area.
yeah,
We should be
yeah.
taking advantage of materials data, all these things. Like, was that not publishable in sort of traditional journals, do you think?
No, and I can give you a couple examples. But yeah, the things like data was at that time not publishable. And it was really not, right at that same time, there was a global push towards open science,
Uh-huh.
really led out of Europe. And then I think US was a little bit behind, but not far behind. And you saw the memos come out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, I think it was 2013, talking about um, people who receive federal funding must publish their data
Yep.
supporting their publications. And then it even went further that the publications themselves should be made available to the public because it was large, those that were funded by federal tax dollars because the taxpayer was paying for it. And
I don't disagree.
often it was oftentimes locked up behind a paywall for a journal. So it was a really exciting time. But at the time, no one was really publishing data. No one was really publishing articles about software, um, and how the software worked, what algorithms it used, how you would interface with it,
Yeah.
what are the pitfalls of using it. And so we saw a real opportunity to go after what I call these other products of research that had no home. And one of the big things we're really striving for is credit. How does a researcher get credit for contributing to the community, things that they have in their possession, but otherwise had no means of sharing it other than putting it on GitHub or at the time, Figshare or Dryad or something like that. But there was, yeah, okay, great, you put it out on Dryad, but okay, you haven't
Yeah,
really described it.
you have to have
You
an
don't get
incentive
credit.
structure,
Yeah,
right? If you
yeah,
want people to share data, share these tools, they have to have
yeah,
a way of getting credit for it. And in the
right.
academic realm, that means it's an article, right? So how clever to make a journal where you can create these articles, which is the data. And to put this in perspective, back in 2012, I was a postdoc. We had done this really exhaustive literature review, and we generated a huge amount of data, and we published it as a review article, and it was great. It got a lot of attention. But I remember I got an email from a company, Citrine Informatics. This was the year that they formed
Yeah,
as well.
yeah,
They reached out and they're like,
yeah,
hey, what are you doing with your data? And I was like, what do you mean? What am I doing with my data? I was like, we built a website. You can visualize these different things. Like in my mind, I couldn't even imagine what else they were interested in with this. And back at the time, they're like, no, if you give us access to your actual raw data, we can do some cool things with it. And that sort of blew my mind. I didn't know anything. I don't think I could have defined what machine learning even was back then. But
yeah,
I took
yeah.
a chance on it, and that led me down this whole rabbit hole, was that interaction. Because at the time there wasn't a place to publish it like that. So I'm excited to see that IMMI, Integrating Materials and Manufacturing Innovation, was created, sounds like then in conjunction with the TMS Society to fill that role.
Yeah, exactly.
So is it published
And
by TMS? Is TMS a publisher?
no, they're a partner with Springer Nature, and Springer Nature is actually the publisher.
So Chuck, I'm kind of curious with this journal being associated with TMS, and obviously TMS is not a publisher. Instead, we partner with Springer. But you're saying that at this time, there's this interest in open access research, and yet currently IMMI is not an open access journal. So what, you want to describe what happened there?
Yeah. So at the time, um, Europe in particular was really driving uh, recipients of EU funding and local national funding to publish their results open access. And it was a very dynamic time. A lot of nations were entering into
Yeah.
agreements with Springer and Elsevier on, hey, how do I get these large block deals? So we didn't have that, but we started with just this idea. Well, let's do open access. That's where everyone's going. Um, and Springer was very gracious in helping us out the first year or two on providing waivers and support for just getting the journal off the ground. But it was clear that while things were developing in the EU on being able to cover open access charges, that same type of initiative really wasn't gaining momentum as much in the US.
I wish it was.
I'm with you. And so the open access charges at the time, no one had that built into their grant budget. And you were talking anywhere from $1,500 to $2,500 for an article to publish. And then it was interesting. You had all this worries at the time, also publicly, kind of counter to this open access uh, movement was, well, if people are paying to publish, is that going to degrade the quality of the articles? How can you trust it because there's too much incentive to
It's a
accept the
fair concern.
article?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, long story short, it didn't work out, and we reverted back uh, after a few years where it was clear it was just not going to be sustainable to a hybrid model where it was a traditional publishing model where libraries would purchase the subscription, but people had the access to also publish open access.
And that's where we're at today. So if you're
Yeah,
interested in publishing open access, go for it. That's
yeah,
fantastic. And if
yeah,
not, then there's a hybrid option.
yeah. And we've seen the open access article content increasing through the years. And I think as recently, we're about 30% open access, somewhere in
Okay.
that neighborhood.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so we have this new journal format then, and since it's inspired by the Materials Genome Initiative and this whole idea of data-centric material science, I love that the tagline under IMMI is Tools, Methods, and Impact of Digitally Enabled Materials Engineering. Is that then summing up the scope pretty well?
Yeah, I think so. We've because integrating materials and manufacturing innovation is not maybe intuitively obvious to, and it's a new concept, right? It's not just a materials journal, it's not just a manufacturing journal. It's how do you bring these things together? And so not only are we talking about integrating experiment with computation, but it's how do we now cross the discipline boundaries to make materials a real variable in design and manufacturing. Currently the standard is we have standards for materials and standards for materials processes, and then we have stagnant data sheets for material performance. Well, that's not very conducive to a new design and being able to trade. Hey, I need more fracture toughness. I could live with a little less tensile strength. How do I get there? Well, right now you've got a data sheet. You live off the data sheet. So if we can make materials a true variable in the design process, that's where we really want to head, which is this whole idea behind digitally enabled materials engineering.
Okay, I love that. So when I look through these articles, I've published a couple times in this journal. I've been a fan of it for a number of years. I've noticed an emphasis not on taking existing approaches and just applying them for sort of, hey, like we all know how to do, say, fit a model to a certain type of model to this data. Let's try it out here and apply it. That's not the type of stuff that gets published here. It's a little mundane. Instead, it's a focus on new approaches. I notice a lot. There's a new idea, or if you do take a sort of existing approach, you apply it in a way such that there's a pretty significant impact and new understanding, new materials insight that wasn't gleaned. Is that what you're aiming for? That this is meant to be not for your everyday work, but rather for a little bit more of the standout work where there's a new approach or really new understanding?
Yes. Yeah. So it's either I've got a new technique that I want to share, whether it's software or perhaps we've published new experimental techniques, particularly with regard to high throughput experimentation.
Yep.
And how do you combine that all? And then when we move more towards the materials engineering side is, okay, now how do you integrate it all? Generally, that's not done in the scientific realm as much, going over to the engineering side of the house, if you will, of how do I apply this? How do I truly now make materials a variable in the design process? So that's also a feature I wish we had more articles on, but they generally come from industry. And how did I do this?
Yep.
How did I apply these novel techniques, digitally based, that scale over multitudes of length and time and bring them together and arrive at a new engineering design and cut out cost and time and risk in the process? And we've had a couple really nice articles that discuss that. So that's where we get at that impact of digitally enabled
Yeah.
materials
Okay.
engineering. It's how telling industry or having industry tell us, how did I do it? Where are the gaps still? What were my challenges?
So inside this banner of tools and methods would fall also data, right? Data is an
Yeah,
enabling tool that allows you to do this. And I remember I published a data descriptor article is what you call them, where the article is describing the data itself. It doesn't necessarily have to have a hypothesis like we thought that if we
right.
change the grain size, such and such. No, it's here's some data and here's how it would be useful to the community. We published one where boy, we put a lot of effort and time into scraping these United States Geological Survey. They put these really nice fact sheets, but they're PDFs, right? And they're rich with information, but they're PDFs. And so this was before the advent of natural language processing, which can more easily access and pull that data out. But we did it by hand, and we gathered a bunch. I think it was from 1998 clear till 2015 for like everything that the United States Geological Survey reports on, which is a couple dozen key materials and elements. And it was a lot of data, and it was fun to have a place where we could publish that, where people could access that information. Has these sort of data descriptor articles been popular for the journal?
Yes, very much so. Um, I think they're still underutilized by the community. I really wish I saw more of them coming in. But the very first one we published uh, uh, from Shop in McDowell, it was on aluminum and copper boundary energies.
Okay.
And I don't remember the numbers now, but I think it's got over 80 citations. And all it was, so like you're saying, it was a digital representation of a variety of different tilt boundaries, grain boundaries, and provided all the data. And they had calculated this using molecular dynamics. And like I said, it's been cited over 80 times now by others. So people are reusing the data for other purposes, and they don't now need to go generate the data themselves. It's there
I
for
love it.
reuse. Yeah,
Very cool.
yeah.
Okay.
Eh,
So we've identified the scope of the journal, its sort of origins. Maybe in the time that's left, tell me about some of the standout things. You've been doing this for, I don't know, 12-ish years. You must
Yeah,
have seen some cool articles come across your desk. You want to highlight a couple for us?
yeah, sure. And I think in terms of these are non-traditional articles that we found a way to publish that have seen great impact and uptake within the community. So even the first year, our very first article was entitled Verification and Validation of ICME Methods and Models for Aerospace Applications. And it was written by two aerospace guys, uh, Brad Calls from Pratt & Whitney and Dan Backman from General Electric, and then Raleigh Dutton from AFRL. And this is back in 2012. And, TMS hadn't even done its study on V&V yet.
This is very
It
early
was
days.
very early days, but here we had two industry folks coming in with Raleigh from AFRL saying, "Hey, this is important. If we're really going to start using these models for real application, real engineering application, we need to have a way of making sure they're fit for purpose, that they're going to give valid results." So that was, and that's been cited a number of times. So it's that type of article that had no other home, right?
Yep.
In a journal. It was still peer reviewed. We sent it out for peer review, had other folks look at it and say, "Hey, here's what's good, here's what's bad." So that was an interesting one. Um, then after that, we had a number of articles. One of my favorite is on Dream 3D. That was
Yes.
highlighted, and that's over 600 citations now. And the idea there, again, it was a tool for how do I handle and represent microstructural data, but multimodal microstructural data, and its ability to plug in to a number of other different, FEM codes and everything else. So that was tremendously impactful. But it was really about a file format and how do I categorize? So where else are you going to publish that? And it was based on HDF5 format, which is kind of new to the materials community at the time. So again, like you were saying before, kind of new, innovative. We haven't seen this before, but where else are you going to publish that? At the time, there wasn't a great place. Um, Another example of an impact article was folks from Rolls-Royce give a very nice overview of how they were applying these computational methods to design a variety of engine components for a jet engine. And they talked about in quantitative terms of how much time it saved them, how much money it saved them. So it really spoke to the real impact to industry and manufacturing on, wow, if we could really do this, if we could pull all these models together, have good V and V on them, have high confidence in them, what does it mean to the engineering design uh, discipline? And
Cool.
so again, where do you publish that?
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know, a couple other things we had that I thought were interesting. This is an interesting story. We published an article on Open CalFad. It was a multinational group that published it, including folks from NIST. And it ended up, it's got over 100 citations right now, but we had sent it out for review. And one of the reviewers wrote back and said, software has no place in peer-reviewed literature.
Is that
Reject.
right? Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So, but we persevered. We had multiple reviewers, so we just, okay, we believe it does. We
Yeah, we
believe it
disagree
has
a little bit.
credit, value to the community. And again, the authors have put a lot of time and investment in this. Rather than just put it on GitHub, let's really explain it, how to use it, how do you interface with it, and then those authors get credit for it. And like I said, over 100 citations, they got good credit for it.
That's amazing. I'm so surprised at comments like that. But we have the benefit of being, 10 years later, and attitudes are changing, which is maybe a good transition. Like, what do you think the journal is going to be going forward? Obviously, you're stepping down as editor in chief, and I am thrilled that I'm going to be able to pick up the banner. I've got big shoes to fill, but I will be the editor in chief starting next year. So I'm already wondering how on earth I'm going to do the job you've done and then some. But I'm curious, in your perspective, like, what comes next? Like, what should we be focusing on? What is you said previously that IMMI was really providing a home for articles that were homeless, right? What does that look like going forward? Where are areas where we need to be growing in the next 10 years?
Yeah, it has still largely been a metals focused and US focused um, journal. Not on purpose. It's just those are the articles we get
Sure.
in, and that's the constituency we get. So I think we've published several articles in composite materials, some on electronics. Um, so I think there's a lot of room to expand. Still with this theme of these tools and impact of this confluence of computation and experiment enabled by data, um, to make pave much more road in more material classes as well and more international. I don't know why it hasn't really trickled out um, more extensively to globally as to, hey, I've got a place I can publish my software now or my data. I mean, there are some other journals now that are publishing data, um, data in brief and scientific data. But this is dedicated to materials, not a general, and it provides authors a lot of latitude in describing their data. Um, and we don't have a page limit, for example.
hmm I was an
So I think there's
associate
a lot of
editor.
opportunity.
Yeah, I was an associate editor at Data in Brief, and it's great. But I would get assigned, you know, review this article on, oh gosh, you name it, like social media use among high school kids, and it's just like, oh, I'm a material scientist. Like, maybe we should have a dedicated journal for materials data. And I certainly feel like IMMI fits the bill. If you have a cool data set, we would love to see it.
Yeah. And we've actually, there's the whole issue of peer review, and we have an extensive checklist of what people are to look for. But I'll go back to that article on aluminum and copper boundaries that was done by Molecular Dynamics. Actually had a peer reviewer check a couple of the
I
results
love it.
and did the calculations themselves to verify that, yeah, these are right.
Looks correct to me.
So it underwent a true peer review, along with all the other things. Does it have a digital object identifier, and is the data well described and all that? So yeah, it's. I was a little surprised that that happened, but very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. Well, I love your idea that, TMS is obviously more than metals. If you go to their big TMS meetings, it's more than metals, but that is definitely home
Yeah,
base for it. But there's a lot more out there in material science,
yeah,
more than just metals. And so I
yeah,
love the idea of expanding the digital approach, tools, methods, impacts of digital material science to not just metals, to polymers,
yeah,
to composites, to ceramics, to hybrid materials, right? I think that's a certainly great area, and expanding our base outside of just the United States a little bit more internationally. I've really noticed that there's a
yeah,
big divide east-west, right? There's, I think you saw that, was it this year, last year, Asia passed the United States in overall R&D funding. So there's research happening in spades out there.
yes,
What we need to be doing is connecting and bridging so that researchers across the globe, whether Asia or anywhere else, realize that there's this great home where they're going to get fast, fair reviews, where it's going to find an audience that read it. And,
yeah,
so that's going to be a goal of mine in the next 10 years as well, for sure.
yeah, yeah. And I think there's still I think the community at large is still getting its head wrapped around the idea of I can publish these other products of research, like data, like algorithms, like software, and get credit for it. We've got, as you know, right now we're at about a 70% reject rate for IMMI. And that's not necessarily a reflection of the quality of the articles we're
No, not at
getting.
all.
It's just, a lot of them are just out of scope. People don't still understand what we're trying to do, and they're submitting more or less, traditional research journals. Whether it's experimental approach or computational approach, but they're kind of like, well, I looked at this material, I did these experiments, and here's the results I obtained. It's like, no, there's other journals that publish that work.
Yeah. Well, we want people when they, crack the journal, no one opens journals anymore. But when you access this, we want you to find really dense, rich number of articles that are all about new approaches, new insights, as opposed to saying in this specific system, here's a sort of routine study that somebody's looked at.
Right. Yeah, we see so many articles. I think another way to phrase it is we see so many articles that are kind of point solutions. And what we're
Yeah.
really looking at
Generalizable.
are
Yeah.
things that have broader impact. It's a technique that could be applied across um, you know, either a number of material systems or problem spaces. But so often we get articles that end, well, I optimize the processing conditions for this material using this technique. Like,
Which is great.
okay,
Honestly,
very,
I'm just tickled pink
yes,
seeing people using digital approaches. But what you're saying is that okay, that works for that specific problem. Some other researcher over here, how could they use your tool? If they can, then let's
right,
talk.
right. Generally, what they're coming up with is, again, there's a home for it. It's just not IMMI.
Yeah,
Coming up with, well, for alloy XYZ, I did friction stir welding, and I found these feeds and speeds worked best.
that's wonderful.
And that's wonderful. But it just doesn't fit where IMMI's sweet spot is.
Okay. Well, Chuck, any last things you want to say about what your experience has been like?
No, it's been a wonderful experience. The editorial board has just been fantastic in supporting IMMI's development and evolution. And as you know, last year we went through the getting this second tagline to help better explain what IMMI is all about. So it's been tremendously rewarding working with the whole board, and the authors have been just tremendous, really providing great articles to us. So that's been just seeing the growth and the uh, kind of the hypothesis that there was a need for this in the community, and that it's paid off. Has been really, really very rewarding. And I wish you all the best of luck in taking it to the next level, and in you know increasing that impact, increasing that reach of both authorship and readership globally. Because I just think there's still untapped potential for the journal to really make much greater advances.
We hope that if you're out there listening to this, realize that I'm the easiest person on the planet to find. And I would love to chat with you. If you've got an article in mind, if you're like, hey, maybe this is the right fit, you want to talk about it, shoot me an email. We're easy to find. Just Google Taylor Sparks at Utah. You can send it to the materialism.podcast@gmail.com or my personal email, doesn't matter. I would love to sort of connect with our audience here on this platform to get more of our listeners, which many of them are early career professionals out there doing this type of work. And if you're interested in publishing, I'd love to give you some feedback and try and even help you if there's something that's not quite ready, figure out what would be the next steps to get it so that it's appropriate for publication in IMMI, because we'd like to see more submissions. Okay, Chuck, it is always a pleasure to chat with you. Best of luck in what is coming next for you. What are you going to do?
Well, keep myself a lot of traveling. Uh, Still actively engaged with a manufacturing conference, helping organize that and put that on. I'm also going to be participating in a study on manufacturing institutes. So still staying engaged for the foreseeable future.
Wonderful. Okay, Chuck, it's been a pleasure. We'll talk again.
Thanks, Taylor. Best wishes.
Yep. I'm just going to close by reminding our listeners that this episode is sponsored by Materials Today, which is an awesome journal, by Elsevier, which is an awesome company in the publishing space. We're grateful for them providing awesome resources like that journal and doing more. They actually have a whole community around material science. You can check them out at materialstoday.com, elsevier.com. We appreciate them. And obviously, we are grateful for the other people that make the show possible. Our team, Andrew, Jared, and I, the people that make the music, Alphabot, Kolobyte, super grateful to them. If you have feedback for us, we would love to hear it. We're going on our 6th year now, which is completely bonkers to me, and we wouldn't be doing it if there weren't people out there listening. So if you've got a favorite episode that you like and you want to tell us about it, it's great. If you want to hear an episode on some topic, tell us and we'll come make it, right? We honestly, almost all the episodes we're doing now are fan requests at this point. So you can find us really easy. We're on Instagram at materialism.podcast. You can send us an email, our Gmail, materialism.podcast@gmail is the way to go, or on Twitter or wherever else. Anyways, it's been a great episode, and we'll see you guys next time.
The inventors of fire, electricity, magnetism, iron, lead, glass, silk, cotton, the makers of tools, the captors of lightning, the architect, the engineer, the musician, are all beneficiaries of the materials of this world, and are bound only by their imaginations in manipulating those materials.